I'm Marites Vitug. Welcome to Southeast Asia Speaks. This is the show where I get to interview resource persons and newsmakers on issues affecting the region. I will be speaking to Professor Mark Thompson on the Duterte presidency as Duterte starts his final year in office. Professor Thompson joins us from Hong Kong. He teaches politics at the City University of Hong Kong and heads the Southeast Asia Research Center. He has followed the Philippines closely as well as other Southeast Asian countries. Thank you so much, Professor Mark Thompson, for making time for this interview.
Magandang umaga, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Of course, the first question everybody here wants to know, July 1, tomorrow, starts the final year of President Duterte's six-year term as Philippine president. Is he a lame duck president? Because he seems to be very popular still, but other presidents before him seem to be entering their lame duck phase as their final year begins.
Yeah, but of course, Rodrigo Duterte is a very unusual politician, and he's a very unusual Philippine president, and therefore the old patterns don't really hold necessarily when applied to him. I mean, the way the Philippine system is set up with no re-election for a president, in a sense, you become a lame duck the day after you're elected or day after you take office. But he's been unusual in a number of respects. And of course, one major one is his popularity, as you mentioned, but that's translated into votes, the 2019 midterms. And he has what we can call an oversized political coalition. He's got this huge majority in Congresses, and there's very little doubt about his dominance of the electoral landscape. There are some problems, though, that he encounters that are typical of Philippine presidents, which are, on the one hand, these coalitions inevitably will break up because as candidates emerge to succeed him, these various factions will go one way or the other. And they will compete against each other, of course. And then there will be some temptation, of course, to distance themselves, at least some of the factions, from the current administration, even if direct criticisms may be only among one or two opposition candidates that exist. One other factor, though, that makes Duterte potentially quite different is this discussion of his daughter succeeding him or running to succeed him. This is unprecedented, of course. Dynastic politics are common. We've had many sons and widows and so on succeed, daughters succeed their as presidents, become presidents, but not directly. So this would be different. And should Sara Duterte run and should she be elected, of course, that would represent enormous continuity in the Philippine presidency, something we haven't seen in the past.
And also, it will be the second time, if ever Sara Duterte runs and wins in 2022, it will be only the second time that a mayor has has leaped over national posts and become president, just like her father. And as you said earlier, that he has an oversized coalition and it's going to break up. And we're already seeing that. As you may know, Senator Manny Pacquiao has started to criticize Duterte, and they belong to the same political party. And Duterte has also heavily criticized him and gotten back at him. Do you see that aside from this, there will be other fissures in the coalition?
Absolutely. The surprise would be if there are no further conflicts. And they're beneath the surface at the moment. And given, as we've discussed, the president's continuing level of popularity, it doesn't seem advantageous to criticize him directly. But of course, in trying to differentiate oneself and trying to establish oneself as a major alternative as the next Philippine president, the temptation is great to become more critical and to take on other factions that you see as hostile to your own ambitions.
In 2019, I interviewed you. So I reviewed our interview. That was the third year of Duterte as president. Now, I'm going to ask you about the fifth year of Duterte's presidency. Or maybe, can you look back at the first 5 years and in just broad terms, or if you want to highlight any themes, what are these, the 5 years of Duterte's presidency?
Well, to start with the more recent aspect of the question. I mean, since we spoke, of course, the major change has been the result of the midterms, which I already mentioned, that overwhelming endorsement, the shutout of the opposition at the Senate level, but of course, more importantly, still the pandemic. And the president's performance during the pandemic has been criticized, and he's been placed alongside other populist leaders, Bolsonaro, Trump, and so on, as public figures who have not performed particularly well during the pandemic. I think that this comparison's somewhat unfair because, of course, Trump and Bolsonaro denied the pandemic. The Philippine president didn't do so very long. Quickly changed his perspective, his approach, and had a very proactive approach. But the critics would say it was overly militarized. It was lockdowns without sufficient testing and tracing, the issues around the vaccine procurement and so on. So there were the administrative issues. There were the issues of how the pandemic was handled, more sort of top-down enforcement, a blunt force kind of governance rather than working together with community groups. The controversy around the community kitchens is representative of that kind of discontent with how bottom-up initiatives were sometimes treated by the government. More generally, back to your question, how I would characterize the Duterte presidency. I mean, one always has to look at his roots in Philippine politics, local politics, as you said, and the way he sort of measures up globally. And, the local roots are very important. He was mayor of what was once one of the most violent cities in the Philippines, racked by insurgency, crime, and so on, and was seen as somebody who cleaned things up, and therefore was not a traditional kind of political boss. He was seen as somebody who stood up against the bad guys in favor of the good people. And it was this narrative of, him representing the people. That's kind of a populist approach and attacking irresponsible elites. He was able to transport to the national level. He nationalized this kind of neo-bossism that he developed in Davao. And of course, his daughter is also, as mayor, continued to uphold with a somewhat different political style. On the other hand, as I said, internationally, he's compared with these other major populist leaders. What I would add, of course, is distinctive about Duterte is the drug war, and in particular, the numbers of people killed, the mass murder involved. If you follow the ICC proceedings that are just beginning, actually, and the accusations of human rights groups, this was, systematic police vigilantism. Small-time users and dealers were targeted. Big fish often were able to get away. So the actual effectiveness of the program has been questioned. But in terms of a legitimation strategy, it was very successful. So unlike other populist leaders who have, of course, excluded or imprisoned or even assassinated some of their opponents, Duterte has gone further in this drug war approach. And that has kind of become his signature program, showing that he's serious about dealing with the problems the Philippines faces, but in a sense, kind of short-circuiting the process of governance, which is, takes time. It takes a gradual building up of institutions, strengthening of institutions. Rather than doing this, it's kind of a shortcut, a strongman approach. A vigilante president, as one observer has called him, who says, okay, I'm going to cut through all these problems, the problems with the judiciary, problems with, drug users being taken to court and getting off and so on. I'm going to, have the police get out there and deal with the problem, even if it results in brutality, as we've seen during the drug war.
You mentioned the recent ICC development, wherein the prosecutor has requested to open a full probe on the Philippines drug war. Will this ICC probe, if ever it is approved, will it be a shadow that will hover over Duterte's last year as a president, or will it just be, in the back burner for us here in the Philippines, or even for him, he has shrugged it off?
Hard to predict exactly, of course, what will come out of the investigation. I think it already is a shadow I mean, clearly his international image is very much shaped by this, and it was even before, of course, the ICC proceedings that through international press coverage, through the advocacy of human rights groups in the Philippines and outside, this sense of something is amiss here. There are hundreds and then thousands, and now some are claiming tens of thousands who have died in this drug war. And this targeting of the urban poor, in particular, urban poor males in particular. So yes, that will continue to be a shadow. Will it affect Duterte and his presidency? Seems unlikely. And I think one point that I'd like to stress is, and this is often overlooked or misunderstood by commentators, and that is Duterte's nationalism. So, the issue of the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea, he's criticized for not being proactive enough on that. But in another sense, he's got a very strong nationalist narrative. I am the representative of the Filipino people. I stand up for them. I do what's necessary, even if it's going to be bloody, as he himself promised it would be, and indeed it was. And if I have to face international consequences for this, I'm willing to do this for the Filipino people. So that's kind of Duterte saying, I am willing to represent the Filipino people. I'm a nationalist. And when critics, remember the Obama administration early on in his presidency, was critical, he attacked Obama, one of the very few global leaders to do so directly. And Filipinos seem to appreciate that here's a Philippine president willing to speak up and not take, criticism from abroad. So I think that in a sense is one thing that Duterte has been very effective about. The stronger the criticism is from abroad, the more he can present himself as, the person standing up for the Filipino people, even if that brings him international criticism.
Yeah, can we zoom out to Southeast Asia? Because I know you've studied Thailand, Indonesia, and other countries in the region. How does Duterte compare to Jokowi or to Prayut, or maybe Hun Sen is quite extreme, I think, but maybe to Thailand and to the leaders of Thailand and Indonesia? How does he compare?
Well, political scientists have been talking about a trend toward autocracy, toward autocratization, or authoritarianism is the more commonly used term. But authoritarianism comes in many different forms. So as you mentioned, Hun Sen is more of a pure authoritarian, and he's dismantled virtually any remains of electoral competitiveness or civil liberties and so on. So he's pretty much a pure autocrat. Prayut is a military leader who has tried to civilianize his regime. He came to power in a 2014 coup, but he held elections that were actually quite competitive in 2019. The problem was after that, the Constitutional Court, but people see this as acting in the interest of the government, banned the Future Forward Party, which had been a new party that had tried to stand up for civilian rule and appeal to young people in particular. And of course, after that, there were huge protests, largely youth protests. So Prayut is an example of somebody who tried to civilianize his regime, tried to make it seem more democratic. That has not been very successful. And of course, he's also had some real problems during a recent wave during the pandemic. So Prayut's legitimacy is at a low ebb at the moment. Joko Widodo, the president of Indonesia, is similar to Duterte in the sense that he has presided over what political scientists argue is democratic backsliding. So civil liberties in Indonesia are less well safeguarded than they were before his presidency. And so what you see with Duterte and with President Widodo in Indonesia is so-called executive aggrandizement. So a president is in power and a president begins to aggrandize powers, but they continue to have democratic legitimacy. Remember, Widodo was recently reelected. And as I said, Duterte's supporters and allies swept the 2019 midterm elections, as we know. So there's no doubt that these leaders have enjoyed democratic legitimacy. And in the case of Duterte, in addition, he's also extremely popular. Widodo somewhat less so in Indonesia. So even though Duterte has been very illiberal in certain ways, the drug war in particular, but also the militarist approach to the pandemic situation, he maintains democratic legitimacy. And that's very distinct from a Prayut who has not been successful in doing that. Widodo, interestingly, has been even more successful than Duterte, but that has to do with the fact that the opposition in Indonesia, which he is using less than democratic means to combat, is primarily an Islamist opposition, which very few outside observers have much sympathy with because the Islamists themselves can be very illiberal. Whereas, of course, the opposition to Duterte, the Yellows, have held up the banner of human rights, criticized the administration for its violations of human rights, also for its militarization and its incompetence and so on. Nonetheless, they haven't been able to gain much traction, and it seems like 10, maybe at most 20% of the population is supportive of this kind of yellow opposition, which also means they're going to have a very difficult time, even if they unify behind one candidate, in winning in 2022.
Oh, okay. Speaking of the opposition, which even if it unifies, they may have a difficult time in 2022. How about the factor of the death of former President Pinoy, or Benigno Aquino III? As you know, in Philippine politics, political parties are weak, and if the joke here is if an Aquino dies, then it may lead to something else. So I know it's too early, but what do you think is the effect of the death of Pinoy on opposition, on the elections in 2022?
Well, as you say, it's much too early to tell. But I'm struck by the fact, even though there has been this outpouring of sympathy, and I think it's kind of for yellow supporters, it's kind of clarified once again in their minds the difference in leadership styles between President Aquino in his much more reserved approach. Just think about his formal way of speaking, his in very fine Tagalog, his sense of you're my boss, I'm your servant. Just a very different political style, one that stressed governance in a kind of a boring, as it were, but competent way. And also, of course, standing up to China in the West Philippine Sea. So a very, very different kind of political style. And so that is, I think, galvanizing for yellow supporters, and also, of course, appeals to people beyond that, because, the fundamental decency of the former president is, I think, beyond dispute. So that was highlighted by that. That said, I am struck by the differences between that and the reaction to the death of Cory in 2009, which was kind of a national revisiting of what it meant to be a country which had thrown off a dictatorship in people power. So it was kind of, in a sense, the pinnacle of the yellow narrative, where it was good against the Marcos evil, it was good governance against kleptocracy, it was democracy against dictatorship. That was all seemingly at stake, and so that's, I think, explains, given also the problems of the corruption of the Arroyo administration, the political unrest. So Aquino was seen as a chance to restore good governance, restore political stability, and bring back the magic of people power, which Cory represented. That has vanished. I think there are very few people who would doubt that the people power narrative is of course for some people still there, but for most Filipinos it just doesn't resonate like it once did, and that's why the reaction now in 2009 is, I think, despite clear sympathy and the millions of supporters and those who viewed the funeral and so on, that's all there, that's true, but it's very different, I think, than this this kind of national mourning for not just Cory, but for what Cory represented, the freedom fighters who defeated Marcos.
That's a very interesting juxtaposition of the context today and in 2010, what happened. But maybe the final question, you wrote a very interesting article recently about, I'll just read my question, about middle-class remorse in the Philippines, which may lead to re-embracing of liberal democracy. So, is liberal democracy dead here, or is it just on the fringes? Maybe you can just talk to us a bit about the middle-class remorse in the Philippines, and do you think this will work now after the death of also President Aquino, Pinoy?
Yeah, well, what I was trying to to point out there is that, again, I'm talking about the yellow forces. And so it's not the entire middle class, but it's that part of the middle class which is very supportive of, particularly, around universities and around the church and the major sort of pillars of the yellow narrative and of the yellow movement. And civil society organizations, I should add as well, very important element in all that. And so what I was contrasting there was their attitude now, their very critical attitude toward the Duterte administration, and trying to uphold democracy, because they're arguing with great plausibility that even though Duterte claims to act legally, that it's in fact involving an erosion of civil liberties, attacks on the press, jailing of opposition senator, the drug war, and all these things. So they're standing up for democracy, and that contrasts with their attitude during the Estrada administration, where Estrada was subjected to impeachment and a Senate trial. He was not convicted, and yet there was that uprising supported by these same yellow forces, including, of course, in the end, Aquino and others. And there was a lot of remorse about that. There already was remorse when the Arroyo presidency turned so bad from the standpoint of the yellows. She became kind of an apostate to this narrative of reformism. She was seen as corrupt, as manipulative. The 2004 election cheating scandal and so on. Hello, Garci, as people will recall. And so there was already remorse then, but even more so now under the Duterte administration. So the sense that this responsibility to stand up for democracy, will it be enough? I don't think so, not at the present, because as I said, that it constitutes a clear minority of voters. If they hold together, 20% block is not insubstantial, but they will have to coalesce with other political forces, which, while distancing themselves from Duterte, will be not so openly critical. I think that's the kind of candidate who would have the best chance in 2022 is a candidate who says, look, we need to do things differently, without saying, Duterte was a bad guy, because that kind of narrative only seems to appeal to a minority of Filipino voters.
Very interesting point you raised there about broadening the coalition, not necessarily like an out and out anti-Duterte coalition. And you really left us with a lot of things to think about. And this is the right moment, I think, for this interview, because many of us are really we're going through a reflection phase after the death of Pinoy. Actually, you contrasted their leadership styles, and you stressed the democratic legitimacy of President Duterte. He is still popular, and of course, many of the Filipinos voted him into office. So on that note, we will end this conversation, and we will look forward, maybe, Professor Thompson, to another interview at the end of Duterte's presidency, and looking forward to the 2022 elections. Thank you so much to Professor Thompson and to our viewers and listeners. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.